So this was, we talked about this as much as we did last semester, but I had a slide in here actually from last year to just show how phones and most mobile devices geotag a photo, and that can come in very handy for what you're using WebGIS for. One student last year did he chose to do a final project instead of the labs and did a project where I don't know how he did this, he took all his Facebook friends whose Facebook profile picture was public and was able to get this information and then mapped where their Facebook profile picture was taken. That was pretty cool. So this is how you do something like that. When you take a picture with a phone, download it. If you go into the properties in Windows and look, notice it has with it a latitude and longitude. So that's how, when we talk about geotagging, and we will talk about that off and on, that's what I'm talking about. So we will continue talking about text content on HTML pages tonight. And one of the most common tags you'll see is just simply, and just to review quickly, HTML is a markup language, meaning that there are sections of the file are denoted with the beginning markup between these brackets here, and then an end markup with a slash. That could deviate a little, and we'll see that later today. So the P content indicates a paragraph, and you can see this P starts here and then ends there. Everything we're talking about here is still pretty simple in the HTML world. So you can see where it started the next paragraph. Nothing too fancy yet. And I think actually the additional text on this slide is a leftover. I had copied and pasted slide, so disregard the href and target. That's from the A link slide. Typically P wouldn't have any attributes within it. So here's one you'll see a lot. IMG. An IMG tag holds an image. And to explain that a little better, it's not really holding the actual image, it's holding a link to where the image is stored. And usually on the web you don't want to, because of internet speeds not being super. They're certainly better than when I started by light years, but still the internet, this will be an ongoing theme, you want to minimize the amount of traffic back and forth when you program in web design. But instead of bitmaps, TIFFs, or full-size images, you should always use PNGs, GIFs, or JPEGs. And as a general rule, because of the type of compression those images are, a JPEG is best for photography, for solid colors, like say you had images of flags. GIFs or PNGs would be better. They are represented with, they represent solid colors better. So here, I'll bring this up in a second, the actual page. This is from UB. So you start out image tag with IMG. The most important thing the most important attribute in the image tag is the source, abbreviated SRC. The source tells you where the image is coming from. It could be a fully qualified source, HTTP:// or relative. If everything's coming from the same server, it can be relative. In other words, we're on this server, wherever the page is, there's an image page, a folder right below that page, and then a JPEG with that name. And I'll do an example of that. Alt, this happens less nowadays, but especially in earlier browsers. Sometimes images would fail, internet connections. So when I used to do this, a lot of people were using dial-up connections that are a lot slower than what we're used to. Certainly here, the UB's connection is so fast. So if an image fails to load, the alt attribute would put text in its place. So this image is called img.banner5, but say that image was unable to load in the person's page. Instead, the browser would place the text Department of Geography bicycle in town instead of the image. So there's not just like a blank spot. Sometimes you might also see in browsers, I'm sure you've seen a little looks like a broken picture frame. That means, say this image isn't where I said it is. That's what you would get, is a little broken frame. Then finally, in this default slide here, these are the most common used tags. Width and height in screen resolution pixels. So you force it. You do often have to do this. You force the screen resolution to be a certain width and height. So first I'll go to so the page has changed. So here, if I right click, I don't want to inspect the element necessarily. So this is a web page devoted to Dr. Bion. If I right click, copy image URL, paste the URL here, you'll notice that that photo of Ling actually is an image at that address.
Copy the image?
You could also, what I did in that case, yeah, you could. That's something you can always do if you need a copy image, and then I could paste it.
The image URL.
I copied the image URL in this case, yeah. But you could do both. And so you'll notice in the source, it links to this image, which the Geography Department webmaster looks like they store images in this content folder, and a couple folders down. So there's her image. Notice that they forced the image to be 180 by 140 pixels through the height and width. And there's a class. We'll talk about class I think next week. I don't think we get into that today. And then they have an alternate setup. If the image didn't load, it says Dr. Ling Bion portrait in its place.
Can you right click the image?
Yes.
Add copy image URL. When I right click, I don't get that. I get
Did you do?
list,
It
like
may.
save picture as and things like that.
What browser are you in? Do you know?
This Internet Explorer.
Okay, that will differ.
Okay. Oh, okay.
In that case, you would get.
Yeah, that's what I got.
None of those match. Oddly enough, what you could do is go to Properties,
Okay.
that gives the properties of the image,
Oh, you can take the URL.
and copy and paste from there.
Yeah.
That's kind of nice too, because it actually gives you the resolution. And note, in this case, the image is 140, the actual JPEG image is 140 by 180 pixels. In a second, I'll get to why I think that's important. So yeah, all those different features like that, but just like on the page, just like I did in Chrome, you can right-click View Source to see the HTML code. So right-click View Source, and there's the HTML code that makes up Dr. Beyond's page. A lot of these other things are things that we'll talk about. We won't get to everything, the whole course just on HTML, but we'll cover the main parts. If I go to, any questions?
With the dimensions, does it mean that we should maybe set the width and the height of the image according to the pixels?
Yes, and that's a good point. That's exactly what I'm about to talk about. Because not only are you right, you should make sure it's the same ratio. And that's what I'm going to show. Say, I'm going to bring up a picture, it's too big. So say it's 2000 by 1000. If you wanted to make it small on the page, you could say 200 by 100 and keep the same dimensions. That makes sense. If you don't, it won't look right. So it's an excellent question.
And if we set it to be automatic, for example, the image will maybe just the original.
That's exactly what will happen. Yes, it would. If you don't, in other words, that's a very, very good question. Let's say you don't put width and height; it's not required. It will default to the image dimensions, and you don't necessarily want to do that because it may be too big. Here they happen to size it exactly the same as the picture that they have of Dr. Beyond. These are that's doing that. This is the one I want. There we go. My daughter loves flags. I think that's Grenada. So if I were to copy this picture, notice it's quite large, 2448 by 3264. So I'm going to copy that photo. So a couple things. The let's see. I'm going to figure out where this page is. Oh, there it is. So here's the location of my HTML page. So a couple things here. So I'm going to reference that. You'll see how I reference that in the image directory below it. So I'm going to add a link to this image on my HTML page. If I can. things aren't cooperating. If I disconnect my work drives, that makes it go faster. So I pasted that image into that folder, images below my HTML page. So I can start out with image, src, and sometimes this will work, sometimes it actually lets me, autocomplete lets me pick the URL. So it knows where the HTML is. I can then go in, find this photo, and it filled that in for me. I don't always trust this. I've seen it still be wrong, so I always double check that before I go forward. So a couple other things here, and we'll start with just this. Notice, usually I said there was a different way to close a tag, and sometimes we'll see these. Instead of /p, when there's no content in between the two tags, you can end it with just a slash inside the initial tag. See the difference there?
You say no content.
So, in other words, I don't need anything else. Like for paragraph, I then need to follow up with text, possibly.
Gotcha.
And so there needs to be stuff in between the two tags. There's no need for stuff in between the two tags here because it's all in the attributes. So to shortcut that a little bit, or shorthand, instead of a separate /img tag, you just put a slash at the end of this tag there. So that says, okay, this tag is the start and finish of the image tag. So when I view in browser, and this will get to exactly what you talked about. Oh no, it's way too big. I didn't put any attributes. You have to scroll way down to see the picture.
So when it's too big, how do you know how to size, or what
Excellent.
size, I should say?
So a screen, and that can start a debate. So my screen is, and I'll explain why. And you may have set this before. My screen is 1280 times 800, which is a pretty typical. Actually, it's better until I have the projector in and decrease it. So that means, and you may have done this before, checked your screen resolution. You can check. Well, I'm not sure you're allowed to check on this machine. So that means there's 1280 pixels wide and 800 pixels deep on my monitor. If I go back to that photo, the photo's 2448 by 3264, so that's why, and it rotates. I've had Chrome do that sometimes. Knows it rotated it. I can't control that. I've had that happen with my iPhone pictures, and I'm not really sure why yet. That doesn't happen, say, from my digital camera. Incidentally, that's interesting. Oh, no, there it is. This is what I talk about. Now you know the latitude longitude of my. Oh, no, it's not. It's the flag store on Transit Road that she was at. So there's the latitude and longitude of the store, and it's altitude above sea level. So just keep in mind, some bad things have happened because people don't realize that in most cases. There's an unfortunate case where a woman had a stalker, and she posted a picture to Facebook, and the person was able to get the picture and find out where she lived. So there's been some high-profile, unfortunate things that happen, and in fact, this wasn't uploaded to Facebook. Since that incident, Facebook strips this off, unless you specifically tell it not to. So at least when using social media sites, Twitter doesn't. I mean, we talked about tweeting in national emergencies, but more and more social media sites are starting to be aware of that. But just it's a good tip. In my GEO 481 class, I asked the students how many students knew the pictures on your phone captured the location, and I want to say 20% of them knew or less. At the very least, it's a public service announcement.
So now you go on Facebook now. I'm assuming like on a desktop, but you go on Facebook now and you right with.
Yeah, if I loaded that picture into Facebook, it would remove that.
Okay, so you okay.
Because of that incident that I referred to.
Gotcha.
But Twitter, it wouldn't. I don't know the rest. I think Flickr and Twitter still, because later in the course you'll see you can map Flickr posts and Twitters, but Facebook does it as a result of that. Now, obviously, there's many cases. Like I talked about the tsunami and earthquake in Japan was one case, Hurricane Sandy. Or in many other cases, that's a good thing to have that. But it's good to remember that's not always a good thing. But notice also, there's the dimensions and the dots per inch. So to answer your question, the reason why your question is not a really easy one, what should the dimensions be, is you can't control people's monitors. The picture will look bigger or smaller on one person's machine versus another person's machine because their monitor is different. It used to be that they would say, assume everyone had a monitor of no wider than 1024. I'm not sure, I'd have to talk to some of our web developers. Many modern monitors now have more than that. So if you want it to be as wide as the screen, you could do 1024 and be relatively safe. A lot of people, I'm assuming everyone here is more comfortable with computers and you get to toy around with the settings. A lot of people, like my parents, for example, just buy a computer, turn it on, and keep all the default settings. And often the default setting on a monitor is 1024. Though I think in 2015 many monitors have higher resolution. Another complete twist to what I just said are these. There's not 10 or 24 pixels. I don't know offhand how many pixels. It's a lot less. So what many web developers, and I'm sure you've seen this when you visit websites, your favorite websites, is a different version. Now web developers have to develop a second version for browsers on phones and tablets, just because you're so limited in space. There's software like Bootstrap and other programs similar to that where you can actually, vendors have written software and sold it, where you could take a normal website, feed it through their software, and it'll spit out a mobile-friendly website that has smaller pictures and so on. In this case, though, obviously the picture was too big. So one thing I could do is say, so this will make it smaller, but let's see what happens. I wish it wouldn't do that, but notice that it's stretched. It doesn't look stretched, or it looks stretched because I didn't keep it in the original dimensions. So the original dimensions were 2448 by 3264. That's why I don't know why it's. To here it actually shows the photo correctly. So if I were to divide the photo by 5, say 490 by 650, it's off a little bit, but it's close. Now notice the dimensions are consistent with the original photo. I still haven't solved the rotation issue, but now the photo is a fifth of the original size. So those are very good questions. That is something you definitely have to consider when sizing photos. I'm just going to try something. No, it didn't do it. Sometimes that maybe I need Photoshop for that. I've just opened up the photo and saved it using another software editing program, and then it works. Or image editing program. But that's not going to solve this issue. Even if I open it in Snagit, notice it comes in the proper dimensions. I don't know what those things mean. And because it's a photo, JPEG is a good oh, now it's right. So now I have to reverse the dimensions. Maybe a graphic designer could help me with this. But now I opened it in Snagit, and then I saved it, and now it's actually displaying correctly. I don't know why. I've never figured out why that is. And sometimes just saving it in another image editing software program has it display correctly. And it seems to be mostly photos coming from my phone. There must be a setting. So notice this is a JPEG. Actually, I don't want to show this with one. I don't want an SVG. Unfortunately, I don't think what my point is going to show up on the monitor. So there's 2 points to this actually. First, I wanted to show the pixelation. But also, going back to internet file sizes, I mean, the third one I say, but you don't want a 2.5 meg file to transfer across the internet. So use file optimization software. I suspect this flag is already optimized. Yeah, down to just 28. It's like 1% of the original of the file size of my daughter. So someone has optimized that. But if I wanted to optimize it even further, that's me. This isn't going to work. It's not going to show up well. You can see on my screen that with the JPEG, the yellow stars are pixely, because JPEGs don't handle solid colors well. You can see it up here. It doesn't translate onto the monitor as well as I thought it would. Where something like SVG or GIF files, that's strange. Yeah, you're not going to notice the difference there, nice and solid, because GIFs represent solid colors like you would get in a country flag. So additional little tip there on graphic design. See, I get this warning. My actual width is 1680. This is a nice laptop, and remember I'm in the IT industry doing programming, so I'm going to have a nicer machine, as all you probably do, than general public. But most of the general public that are using your site won't have a nice machine like this, the expertise. So this will show you the challenges you face now with the mobile application development. The iPhone 5 and iPhone 6 have pixels size of only 320 by roughly 560, so you have to fit a lot more into a very small space. Though there's other information here about rasterizing and getting more out of that, this is really the dimensions on an iPhone. So you're up against, you're making much smaller photos. Now, you're not just making the photos smaller to fit the iPhone, you're optimizing them even more because of the network speed. Though these are nice and fast, especially with LTE, they're not as fast as an internet connection on a laptop. So those are two additional headaches to consider when programming to a mobile device, is the less screen resolution and a slower internet. You wouldn't want a 2.5 megabyte image file on a mobile website. So some of these attributes, we talked about this already, the alt is alternative text that will appear when the image is loading or if it cannot load. Let's try that. And that's a good point. The slide actually makes a good difference. It's not only if it cannot load, it's also it's going to load too quickly. But the alternate text will appear if this computer is too fast. Maybe if I take it to the original size. It was too fast, you couldn't see it. So if you have a really large photo or a slow internet connection, the text should appear while it's loading. In this case, I purposely misspelled the link and notice how it displayed the alternate text where the photo should be, and the little broken picture frame indicates the photo is missing. When you see that, it could either mean the web programmer missed the link, or something happened during the internet transfer and the link was lost. We just discussed height and width and length. Not length. ID is a unique name for every string. This will become more important as we get into JavaScript. But like we learned in 555, desktop arc objects in C#, This is a way to give this attribute a variable name, so that in code like JavaScript on this page, you could refer to that image with this ID. And we'll do that a lot more when we get into JavaScript shortly. And then the most important thing is the SRC, or source, the path to an image. Here it's a relative path. What I just did was a relative path, but you're also free to also give a full path with full HTTP, depending on the situation. I think in some websites you will see so here there's an image on today's CNN page, and they chose to give a fully qualified path to the entire image. And there's the image there. And the slide has examples of both. Any questions? Obviously, that's one that you'll use quite a bit as a web developer. An HTML form is a way to use HTML to gather data from the user with input types. The HTML for desktop developers here, the HTML form will be similar to the Windows forms we did. Say we did in Lab 1 in the spring, when you built a calculator. We'll actually do that for Lab 1 here, but a web version of that same calculator. The forms allow you to interact with a user. It's a good way on HTML to gather data from a user. We'll talk about a variety of different input types here. And the form, it's a little trickier in HTML because you have to define the area of the page that is the form. In Windows, it's not hard. The whole form is the form. So here we define the area that's the form, starting with a form tag and ending with a /form tag. So users will interact with inputs that are between those two tags. And we'll talk about this. Quite a bit of the rest of this evening will be taken up by forms, because there's a lot you can do with them. So the form tag, as I said, signals beginning of the form on the page. It should have at least one control for interacting with users. I mean, it may not in some cases. In most cases, though, it would, or you wouldn't be developing a form. So right in the form tag itself, there's two attributes of note here: an action or on submit. A form is submitted when the button on it is clicked. We'll see examples of that. So if this is a user form, and it is, the user hits the button that submits the form, and an action occurs. And the action redirects the page to a new URL. So in a classic form, once they submit, hit the submit button, all of the things that have been entered are packaged and sent to a different URL. And so the action attribute, you would enter the URL there of the page that the form should go to. What I see a lot more of, and what I've done more of, is on submit. There's another attribute you can put on the form. That calls a JavaScript function you would define. So this on submit equals, this would be the name of a JavaScript function. So when on submit is in there and you click the button, that JavaScript function will run. And this is more directly related to what we'll do, so we'll spend more time on that, as we'll spend a good 2 or 3 sessions at least on JavaScript shortly, starting Wednesday and going into next week. But the commonality between these two things are both are used to gather what the user entered and then send it for processing. And actually, if you go to the previous slide, you'll see there's an action demo form.asp. That screenshot is outdated. ASP stands for active server pages. We don't really do programming those anymore, but at least it gives you an idea of a form being sent to another page for processing. You'll also see in the next slide after that, we'll start to get into that. You'll see a very common text tag called input. There's many different types of things we can do with the input tag, and we'll spend some time now going over them. Any questions? As I hinted at a moment ago, the input tag is diverse. It represents a lot of different things, a lot of different ways in which you can help the user interact with you through a form. The way to distinguish that is there's an attribute on input called type. And these are at least 9 different ways in which we can build input. And we define what type of input through the type attribute. So for example, there's a type called text for these two, and a type called email on that. So some of the most common ways you can use a type attribute is you can use it to set up a button that someone clicks, checkboxes, file upload, not as often. You can actually store a hidden variable. You can use an input tag to hide a variable on this page. So a hidden variable is something you can use JavaScript to set if the user doesn't see it. I don't recall if we needed to get into that for this course. I've done that quite a bit. You can have a typing image. In other words, I could put that picture of the flag inside a form, and instead of saying IMG, I could have input type equals image and the URL, and when that happens, clicking on the image will cause an event to occur. A password type, and we will go over a number of these. A password type is a text box. A text box allows the user to type in information. If it's a password type text box, you'll just see the dots. Now they have that security measure, so someone looking over your screen can't see your password being typed. Radio are radio buttons, and just like on the desktop, you use radio buttons if you have mutually exclusive categories you want the user to choose from. And then text gives you the ability to do a text box. So in the simplest sense here, the input button allows the user to interact with the form with a click. So this area is my form. So if I preview that in the browser, oh, that's actually a value tag. Nothing happens. I haven't programmed anything yet, but you can see my form here with the button. One other thing I would do if this was in code, and you'll do in Lab 1, is that gives it an ID. So now if I have a JavaScript script, I could refer to that button with the variable name btn run. As we'll see, just like C#, JavaScript is case sensitive. So it would have to have the same combination of lowercase and uppercase letters. So another possibility that you'll use quite a bit is a checkbox. And this is very similar to a checkbox when building a Windows form. It lets the user check yes to indicate yes by checking it on, or indicate no by checking it off. Unlike a radio button, which we'll do in a bit, it doesn't get tied to any other control. You can also, two other key points about the checkbox are that the checked keyword can be used if you want the checkbox to be already checked on when the page loads. And the location where you put in between the tags indicates what text will appear next to the checkbox.
You had value true. What's that?
I think, let's see, that interchangeable with checkbox. That may be deprecated. Let me see. This has changed in 2012. Good. Let me check. So here in 2012 I did checked equals checked. Let me take that out. That's right. Okay, so I don't do that very up. The value is only used when you're submitting a form. It's indicated here. It doesn't control whether it appears checked or not. The contents of the value property don't appear. They'll be the item in the value property, which you can change on code, will be sent if the form is submitted. And we'll get into that in a bit. Only if the checkbox is checked on. So that's not something we would get into, at least when we do a GIS that often.
I just
Yeah.
want to make sure it's not required.
It is not required. Unless you wanted to submit a specific value with the checkbox when it's checked, which I don't think we'll do, so you could leave that out. The other difference is between when I did this in 2010 and 2012 is instead of just checked, it seems to be requiring checked equals checked. If you want it to appear already checked when the page starts. And of course, once the page is up, the user is free to check the boxes on and off. Questions? The next input type would be an image. It lets the programmer add an image to a page similar to the IMG tag, but now the image is clickable and submits the form. Oops. So I'll actually so rather than just an ugly button, say you want a nice image like this, I'll save this image down. Call it arrow. Input type equals image. An SRC tag just like the image tag. Alternative text just like the image tag. .256 by 256. We'll make it smaller. Once I click, there's no submit action, so it's just going back to itself, but notice how clicking it causes something to happen. Just the something that happened isn't too exciting yet. So instead of just being an image, that's now an image input with a submittable action. Get instructions. So another type of input is the password input. Our first text box, and it's a specific type of text box we'll see. We'll do a lot more with text boxes, not the password type, but notice with a password type input, no matter what I type, it shows the dots. And so it's someone looking over who can't see. Oops. Maybe I should do that. Next item, there's not too many more. Radio buttons. And again, for the desktop programmer, this will be familiar. The radio button allows the user to make a choice from several options. The checkboxes, you could put 10 checkboxes on your page, and they could check every box out. The checking of one box doesn't affect the other boxes. Checking each box is independent of the others. In a radio button, however, you only want one item to be selected, where the values are mutually exclusive, male, female, country of origin, or something like that. So here we also have a couple things with this. Let's first look at there's 2 radio buttons. So there's 2 input tags with a radio type on them. We want to tell the browser which buttons are mutually exclusive. In other words, if I click on mail and one of these other items are already selected, which ones do I unselect? And that's done with the name tag, the name attribute. Because both of these have the name attribute sex on them, when any of these with the name sex are clicked, all the others will become unclicked. So if you have male selected and you click female, the male will become unselected. So it's mutually exclusive. I also use an ID tag to indicate the actual ID in code of each individual radio button. And I indicated the value. So this makes a little more sense, so it'll be more often used than the checkbox value that you asked about earlier. So when we select, I'm going to click on the male and hit submit, the value male will be sent to the server.
So you got one form with 2 buttons.
Yes.
Okay. The label and then the input. Okay. I'm just making sure I'm following what you got.
It sounds like you are, and I haven't mentioned the label yet, but you're exactly right. Label 4 equals tells us which button the label goes with. So you're exactly right.
And then the last input is
For the button, yes. And in this example, so we won't use active server pages. They're kind of old, but the concept is the same. Hitting the submit button would cause that page to load. So in traditional ASP, you would click this button, it would go to a second page that would then do something with what you say. Oops. So if we were to code this, and just to show, yeah. This autocomplete's putting in slashes where it's not always needed. Oh. And I just realized why. I was going to say I don't know why. Its document type is HTML5. But let me see if it still does that. I bet it doesn't now. That still does it. I don't know. HTML5 you may have heard about is a new version of HTML. It's just becoming popular. That has a lot more multimedia abilities like video. It will eventually, is already starting to replace things like Adobe Flash, Microsoft Silverlight. So here, I guess that's fine. I changed this up a little to stress that there's a couple different things here. The label just indicates what will show up on the page. It doesn't have to be exactly the same. So I changed them so they're not exactly the same to make that point. So here, when a person clicks their gender and clicks submit, the value that's passed will actually be just M and F. It doesn't have to be the name the same as the label, in other words. Nor does the ID. I changed the ID to read RDO male and RDO female, short for radio button male, radio button female, just to reinforce for you that and I actually then should change these to RDO male and RDO female. I just caught that. That they don't necessarily have to be named the same. Oops. So notice clicking one button, and if you don't like how everything's just being thrown together like this, we'll talk about tables shortly, and the best way to resolve that mess will be something we'll be talking about relatively soon tonight. But the key point for now is notice how clicking one button causes the other button to become unclicked, and it doesn't have to be just two. So here, even though we have three possible choices, only one can be selected. So there's an example of radio buttons. Any questions? This is one of the the last slide on the input attribute, but last but not least is probably one of the most important one. Just the type equals text is a simple text box, and you'll do something like this in Lab 1. The text box just lets the user type in something. And just about every page has a text box on it somehow. This is how you would do that. Like here, search Facebook. That's a text box. Notice they have what are also probably input images, like the search button. Instead of a button saying search, they have a little magnifying glass. So you'll see on common web pages that they use this or similar functionality. While that appears to be a button input there where it says post. type equals text. And it could be this simple. So it's a text box right there that you see. Allows the user to enter in information. That's the end of the discussion on the input tags. If there's no questions, we'll move on to other tags in HTML that you'll find of use. Well, not quite, almost the end. We saw this a couple slides ago, but just to have a formal slide introducing them, the label tag allows you to associate text with any input tag. It doesn't have to be a radio. My example is with a radio button, but it doesn't have to only be a radio button. You can use this with any input tag. And more than just having a nice piece of text there, it is important for accessibility, especially if you have handicapped users. It also makes your site easier to use. If you click on the label, it activates that input. So if I were to click the word mail, the label, it also clicks the radio button. I'll show you with that in action. So notice, even though I clicked on the label, I prefer not to answer, or the label female, the radio button activated. So it makes it easier if you didn't have the label set up that way. If you put the text on the screen in a different manner, the user would have to click exactly on the radio button. Questions? If you have programmed in C# and built Windows forms, you've recognized a lot of these controls. But one that you might have seen missing up until now is the drop-down list. The drop-down list is very handy in desktop programming. But in HTML, we don't use it in conjunction with an input tag. We use it in conjunction with the select tag. So a select tag lets us define, in other words, a pick list. If you want the user to pick from a bunch of choices, we use a select tag, and the choices that we give are option tags. Some space between these. And So here, we also have the option to send back, just like we saw before, a different value. So in between the tags will be what appears to the user, but when the form is submitted or when we access this through code, the value would be here. So if the user chooses Brazil and hits submit, the value sent to the server is not Brazil, but BR. Now the user can pick from the list. One other thing we can change with multiple equals multiple. And we can also define an array variable. We'll talk about that a little in JavaScript. We talked about something very similar in C#. An array is a type of variable that contains a list of things. I can now with the control key select multiple items. So in this particular case, those 3 nations would build an array of 3 into the so the variable counties would be populated as an array of 3 items with the 3 countries I select. So that's how we make a pick list have multiple countries.
So if you didn't want multiple countries, you take out the multiple out of the tag.
Yes. You can only pick one at a time. I think you can still remember the name of the style. Size, of course. It's a couple things different here. Notice I can't, multiple's gone, I can only select one country now. And with size equals 3, notice the other difference is that now it shows at least 3 items in the list. Since I have more than 3 items, I can scroll up and down. But those are 3. Also notice that this opens new pages every time, so I have to keep closing these. Size equals 3 does that, and then option value or no multiple anymore.
So how do you have them all in one form? You want to have multiple.
Okay.
And you want to have size 3. So how do you have those?
So you could still have multiple even with the size if that's.
Okay.
Yeah. Why don't I'll just make it, in that case what you might want to do is make it a list box, make it the full amount. So now you could have the best of both worlds as they're asking. You can do multiple and control the number of countries that are available. So that's an example of the select list. The next item is similar to an input text type, but it's actually its own tag called text area. Text area allows multiple lines of text. You can set a cols and rows attributes to define the maximum width and height. The cols will be the number of characters in the text area, and the height is the number of rows or lines. So in some cases, you can also set read only to true. And where you might want to do that is, we've all seen these. I'm not finding exactly what I want, but you all know what I mean, where you go to sign up for a new website and there's a box with too much text to read. There's a bit terms and conditions. That's a text area most likely. And in that case, that's set to read only because you don't want people changing the terms and conditions. You want them to read it. Set read only to false if you actually do want someone to type in a novel. So here, do text area, say cols equals 20, rows equals 20, rows equals 4. You see the page actually let a little more than 20. So you'll notice it allows me to type. It actually does expand. So it shows the first 4 rows, and I thought 20 characters, even though there's a little more than 20. But that allows you to set a read-write text area if you want the user to be able to enter in a larger piece of text.
Seen it where they have the terms and conditions at the bottom of the page, and they won't allow you to go past that page until I guess scroll down the entire box.
Yes.
And then that triggers the
button.
Checkbox.
That's a really good point, because what you can do is, I don't know if I can emulate all right now. But there's an attribute in a button or any input called disabled. So I've added that. Watch the difference. Oh no, it's this one. See, click me is disabled. It's grayed out. So we also talked, we'll do more of this. We talk about events on controls. So the text area should have an event. Let's see what events they show. Maybe it's not a text area.
Also, the event is when you get to the bottom of the text and it triggers the checkbox to appear.
Yes. And I may not be able to find this a lot, but that's exactly what happens. You scroll down, the event is exactly that. You've reached the end. And then the button, yeah, sometimes the checkbox appears out of nowhere. Other times it's a button that's disabled that suddenly becomes enabled again. And on that note, there's also we'll talk about styles after the break, but rather than just graying it out, you could hide it, which is what some of the web pages that you've seen does. Actually, the checkbox in that case is invisible until the other conditions are met, and then it appears. Yes.
When we look at the forms and the different inputs for do they have to be in a certain order?
Not necessarily, no.
The female and the male buttons, how they appear on the page, does that have to reflect or correspond with the HTML page?
Not necessarily. You can put them in any order you want. And in that case, it wouldn't matter because only one value is being sent. So it depends on the situation. Alphabetical, however you want to do it is okay. We're going to switch gears quite a bit. I might use markers for this and talk about another major element to an HTML page. A table. In its simplest form, an HTML table is used to emulate something like Excel. If you want to show a table of data, such as change in population here. This is an HTML table. So that's the basic use of an HTML table that we'll go over. But tables also have a great side benefit of letting you format and organize the content of our page. Remember we had all that input boxes just in a mess? We could put them in a table. And so very often tables are used for that. So here, instead of text like this, you could put the button right inside a table cell and then kind of force them to be in a certain order in size. So we'll define what some of the table items mean in a second, but that's a secondary and very commonly importantly used use for a table. So here, a table has associated with it some subcategories. And we usually talk, I'll mention TH, but honestly we usually deal with TR and TD. TH stands for header, which will be bolder. But a TR is a row in a table, and then a TD is a column. The rows come first. So when we first define a table, the first thing that we define is a row. And then that row has, so the table has a row within it, the row has columns within it, and the columns are assigned with TD. So I'll just copy what I did in the slides. This won't. It doesn't really show much yet because it really should be within a TD. So within the TR we can have multiple TDs. Like that. That's what I want to do. So see that up at the top, there's our table with its one row and two columns. That's actually row 1. So we could add a second row and more TDs. So you can see our table taking shape here. So instead of that text, we could do something like this. You can put the image right in the table. That way you control exactly where it is on the page. This does make more sense, but just to show you how you can use, it's still kind of ugly, we'll talk about style sheets in a bit, but notice how I'm using the table to kind of force where things are in relation to each other. That's a common use of a table beyond just displaying data. So now it's still pretty ugly, but now I've at least forced the items to be in line with each other and in a specific spot on the page. Now that I took about a minute, and notice now also because this third column had no content in it, it collapsed. Obviously someone that was doing that for real wouldn't spend 2 minutes on it, they'd spend a lot longer, but it shows you the idea. Oh, it didn't expand. So you can do a lot more with styles with tables. Boy, that projector's color, that's actually blue. The colors on that are horrible. Or aquamarine, actually. So this is a little sneak preview of after we'll take our break shortly and come back and talk about style sheets. That's an example of a style you could set on a cell or just about anything else. So I forced that cell to be 200 pixels wide, and I set its background color to aquamarine, even though it looks yellow there. So a quick introduction to the power of tables. I showed this example already of actually using a table where the data is actually included here. What you can't see very well on projector, notice the headers are TH, not TD, they're just bolder because of that. You can't really tell that well on this slide.
What's the difference between TH and TD?
TH is a TD, but it's a header to the column, the H. So in this default case, it made city and the years bolder, although that's impossible to read up here. Using style sheets, it will talk about you could change up how headers draw. Also, kind of in the same token as the TH, on the page, you kind of have something similar to Microsoft Word. You know, you can see how set styles for headers. You have tags, and I admit I don't use this very often. I like to force certain fonts in using style sheets. But you have tags H1 through H6, which in the absence of any other style will just give you bolder and bigger text. Say your web page is, I would see this used a lot more than 15 years ago versus now. Any text within the H1 tag will be bigger and bolder. H2 will be slightly bolder. So think of a report where you have major chapters and then sub-chapters and so on. Those are the headers. I mentioned this at the beginning. P represents paragraphs. So you can use P, you may notice me using P to kind of separate off some of my examples, but the most common use would be to define paragraphs just like you would in a term paper. So this is the first paragraph of text, this is the second paragraph of text. So you can see them separated when the page is previewed. We actually did this last week, but the A tag stands for attribute. Its most commonly used attribute is href, which is a link to a new website. So when the person clicks on the A tag, the browser will continue to the new website. And I think I already had that in my example. Oh, I removed it. Oh well, you remember. Some of these are review, but as we saw earlier in the evening, the IMG tag with a source lets you link using either a relative path or a fully qualified HTTP path to an image, like a JPEG, and there I've forced the image widths and heights. There are also a variety of formatting tags available. And by variety, the examples I would use the most are B, I, and sub and sup. So just B is bold. So it's bold, italic, and superscript. So here on one line is an example of the I tag for italics, B tag for bold, and sub is the subscript tag. And just to get them all, there's the superscript tag there. The next topic in the course is cascading style sheets. Why don't we take a little break and come back and start that in a few minutes.